The freezing rain tasted of copper and burning propellant when the sudden silver flash of a rifle scope from the ridge above proved that the men hunting us were using the encrypted radio frequencies of my own unit. I pressed my back against the jagged granite face, feeling the violent vibration of heavy mortar fire shaking the mountain beneath my boots, while blood soaked through the tactical sleeve of my uniform. In that single, agonizing heartbeat, every military order I had ever trusted crumbled into ash, leaving me standing in the crosshairs of a betrayal that went far deeper than this muddy ravine. Why were my own superiors giving our precise coordinates to a mercenary force operating outside international law? How had my classified reconnaissance unit been converted into a target for an execution team that knew every shadow I was trained to hide in? My thumb hovered over the secondary radio transmitter, the red light blinking in rhythm with the rapid pounding of my pulse. I knew that pressing that button would send the warning to the 4 stranded operators trapped down in the tree line, but it would also instantly reveal my concealed position to the heavy machine gunner sweeping the slope just 20 yards away. The crunch of tactical boots on wet gravel cut through the whistling roar of the incoming artillery, and as a shadow stepped over the crest of the rock right above me, I raised my suppressed rifle toward the silhouette. Before I could fire, a cold steel barrel pressed firmly against the back of my neck. I did not move a single muscle, holding my breath until the burn in my lungs threatened to trigger a violent cough. The cold steel of the barrel remained pinned against the base of my skull, freezing the rain on my skin into sheer ice while the storm raged through the ancient pines above. "Who is the ghost on the ridge?" whispered a dark voice in heavily accented English, the sound barely audible over the roaring mountain wind. Instead of answering, I tilted my chin up slightly, allowing the shadow to see the faint green glow of my night vision optics reflecting in the mud. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the stench of cordite and pulverized wood, until a sudden burst of heavy machine gun fire erupted down in the valley. The mercenary shifted his weight for a fraction of a second to check the source of the noise, and that tiny lapse in vigilance was all I required. I drove my elbow backward into his sternum, feeling the armor plate crack under the impact, and swept my leg around his knee to send him sliding down the wet granite. I scrambled up the muddy bank, my pulse hammering against my ribs, and ducked into the hollow of an ancient oak tree. 10 miles to the north lay the heavily fortified command post of Operation Iron Timber, the place I had called home for the past 6 months. I was a senior intelligence analyst and marksmanship instructor, assigned to Task Force Trident, a joint special operations group operating along the border. My father had been a decorated naval officer who spent 30 years teaching me that chain of command was absolute, that loyalty to the unit was the only sacred law worth dying for. For months, my daily routine had consisted of monitoring satellite feeds, cross-referencing tactical reports, and training elite reconnaissance teams for deep territory insertion. Lieutenant Cole Hayes and his men in Team Alpha were among the finest soldiers I had ever worked alongside. They were disciplined, fiercely loyal, and entirely unaware that the high-level operational plans handed down to them were being drafted by someone who wanted them dead. The tension had begun to build 3 weeks ago when I noticed subtle anomalies in our encrypted communications network. Logistics reports were missing geographical markers, satellite surveillance feeds of the eastern sector were being routinely wiped every 48 hours, and high-value intelligence concerning the Vulov syndicate was being classified above my clearance level without explanation. The syndicate was a ruthless mercenary outfit composed of former elite operatives, known for trafficking illegal armaments through the dense mountain passes. When I raised these discrepancies with Commander Marcus Vance, the senior officer overseeing our regional operations, he dismissed my concerns with a cold, patronizing smile. He told me that long nights behind a computer screen were making me paranoid, reminding me that my primary duty was to analyze the data provided to me, not to question the origin of the orders. His tone was smooth and polite, but his eyes remained detached and vacant, devoid of any genuine warmth. 2 days before the ambush, I happened to overhear a hushed conversation outside Vance's private office. He was speaking on a secure satellite line, using tactical jargon that had no place in our official mission parameters. He mentioned grid coordinates corresponding directly to the valley where Team Alpha was scheduled to perform what was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance sweep. When I tried to access the mission manifest to verify the safety protocols, my security clearance was mysteriously revoked due to an administrative error. A deep sense of unease settled in my stomach, growing heavier with every passing hour. I knew the layout of those mountains better than anyone in the compound, having spent hundreds of hours studying the terrain features and sniper perches overlooking the valley. I knew that the specific ravine assigned to Team Alpha was a natural kill box, a narrow corridor with steep walls and zero cover if an enemy force managed to secure the high ground. Unable to shake the feeling that something catastrophic was unfolding, I took a heavy decision that violated every rule in the military code. I packed my specialized Mark 13 sniper rifle, secured a custom ghillie suit from the armory without signing the ledger, and slipped out of the perimeter under the cover of a dense morning fog. I did not leave a paper trail, nor did I notify my team members, knowing that if I was wrong, my career in the military would be permanently destroyed. I trekked through the punishing mountain terrain for 14 hours without rest, fighting against the biting cold and steep inclines until I reached the ridge overlooking the designated coordinates. When I settled into my hidden observation post beneath a canopy of moss and pine branches, my worst fears were immediately confirmed. There were no mere 10 guards as the intelligence brief had claimed. Over 50 heavily armed mercenaries were already dug into fortified positions, holding heavy weaponry, mortar tubes, and signal jammers pointed directly at the entry route. They were not preparing a defensive hideout, they were preparing an execution. Within minutes, Team Alpha crossed the tree line into the valley below, walking straight into the trap that had been meticulously designed for them by their own command structure. I watched through my high-powered optic as the forest erupted into chaos, mortar shells shattering the trees and heavy fire pinning Hayes and his men into the mud. Now, as I crouched beneath the dripping oak tree on the ridge, watching the mercenaries tighten their net around the 4 trapped operators below, my hand rested on the cold bolt of my rifle. I had been ordered to observe and report, to remain a silent ghost in the woods, but watching Hayes duck behind a rotting log while his men bled out proved that orders were no longer worth the paper they were written on. I adjusted the elevation turrets on my scope, aligned the crosshairs with the head of the mercenary commander shouting orders into a radio, and gently squeezed the trigger. The suppressed crack echoed across the peaks, and the enemy leader dropped instantly into the mud. Down in the trench, Hayes looked up toward the ridge in total bewilderment, completely unaware of who was firing or why the tide of battle had suddenly shifted. I racked the bolt, chambering another heavy round, knowing that taking this shot meant I had crossed a line from which there was no possible return. Through the scope, as the mercenaries scrambled for cover in utter confusion, I caught sight of a tactical radio hanging from the belt of a fallen syndicate officer. The digital display was flashing with an active incoming frequency, displaying a secure unit call sign that made my blood run cold. The call sign flashing across the digital screen belonged to the personal communications terminal of Commander Marcus Vance. My breath hitched as the realization settled over me like a heavy shroud. The man who had taken an oath to protect the soldiers under his command was actively managing the ambush from the warm comfort of his office, feeding live movement updates to the mercenaries in real time. I reached down and snatched the radio from the dead officer's tactical vest, slipping the earpiece into my ear beneath my hood. The audio was filled with static, but Vance's voice came through with terrifying clarity, precise and completely devoid of emotion. "Target unit is attempting to break north along the riverbank," Vance instructed over the encrypted channel. "Move Squad 3 to the choke point near the footbridge and collapse the overhang with heavy mortar fire. Leave no survivors." I pressed my back against the damp earth, my fingers tightening around the cold metal of my rifle stock. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place with horrific logic. This was not a routine intelligence failure or a simple tactical oversight. The entire operation had been manufactured from the beginning to eliminate Team Alpha. Vance was using the Vulov syndicate to clean up a high-level operational mess, using my teammates as disposable assets to cover up an illegal weapons network that went straight to the top of our division. I adjusted my position, shifting slightly on the ridge to gain a better field of fire down toward the river. Through my optic, I saw Lieutenant Hayes and his men struggling through the thick mud, carrying their wounded heavy weapons specialist. They were heading directly toward the footbridge, completely unaware that Squad 3 was already moving to cut off their only escape route. I dialed my scope to 400 meters, compensating for the wind sweeping through the canyon and the steep downward angle. My heart beat slow and steady, 4 quick pulses between every shallow exhalation. I aligned the reticle with the lead mercenary, setting up a heavy machine gun position near the bridge supports, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck true, dropping the gunner before he could set his bipod. I racked the bolt with practiced speed, catching the spent casing in my palm before it could hit the rocks, and picked off the second operator attempting to load a mortar shell. Down in the valley, Hayes recognized the sudden gap in the enemy line and redirected his men into the dense brush along the bank, narrowly avoiding the trap Vance had set for them. Over the radio earpiece, the calm tenor of Vance's voice cracked for the first time. "Syndicate Team Alpha, report," Vance demanded, his tone rising in pitch. "Why has Squad 3 stopped moving? What is happening on the northern ridge?" Silence was the only response from his mercenaries on the ground. They were scattering into the timber, utterly terrified by an unseen sniper who was methodically dismantling their formation, shot by shot. "You have an unmanifested asset in your sector," Vance barked into the radio, his composure entirely shattered. "Who is firing on those coordinates? Identify the shooter immediately." I keyed the transmitter button on the captured radio, taking a deep breath to settle the shaking in my hands. I did not speak a word, but I allowed the distinct metallic sound of my rifle bolt sliding forward to echo clearly down the open frequency. On the other end of the line went deathly quiet. I heard the sharp intake of Vance's breath as he recognized the unique mechanical click of the Mark 13 rifle, a weapon he knew I had taken from the armory 2 days prior. "Bennett," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rage. "You have no idea what you are interfering with. Stand down and abandon your position immediately. That is a direct order." I released the button without giving him the satisfaction of a reply. Instead, I brought my eye back to the optic, tracking a cluster of 3 mercenaries attempting to flank my ridge from the eastern ravine. They were moving quickly, using thermal imaging devices to cut through the heavy fog and rain. Vance was giving them my exact location, using the signal from the radio I was holding to pinpoint my coordinates on his command map. He was using the system against me, but he had forgotten one critical detail. I knew the network architecture because I had helped build it. I pulled a small tactical datapad from my vest and linked it directly to the captured radio using a short connector cable. My hands moved across the touchscreen with speed and precision, overriding the security protocols and routing a command loop back through the transmitter. Instead of sending my location to Vance, the loop began extracting the encrypted logs stored on his private server, downloading every transaction, every troop movement order, and every communication log he had exchanged with the Vulov syndicate over the past 6 months. The progress bar on the screen filled slowly, moving block by block while the sound of boots crushing wet foliage grew louder on the slope below me. The 3 mercenaries were less than 50 yards away now, moving in a tight wedge formation with their rifles raised. I glanced down at the screen. The transfer was at 80%. If I moved now to save myself, the connection would break, and the evidence proving Vance's treason would be lost forever in the unit's automatic server wipe. I remained completely still behind my cover, my thumb resting gently on the frame of my sidearm. Through the pine branches, I saw the lead mercenary step over a fallen birch tree, his night vision goggles glowing faint green in the twilight. He turned his head toward my hideout, his barrel rising to sweep the mossy rock where I lay hidden. The datapad gave a soft, silent vibration in my palm as the screen flashed green, confirming the transfer was complete. At that exact moment, the mercenary locked eyes with me through the brush, raising his weapon to fire. I dropped my shoulder and rolled sharply to the left, just as a heavy volley of automatic fire chewed through the mossy log where I had been lying a second before. Splinters of damp wood and pulverized bark showered over my face, but I was already back on my feet, drawing my sidearm with my right hand while keeping the datapad secured inside my tactical vest with my left. I fired 3 double taps through the thick mist. The suppressive rounds caught the lead mercenary in the chest plate, staggering him backward long enough for me to clear his line of sight and brake for the rocky ridge behind me. Up ahead, the terrain crested into an open ledge that overlooked the compound's secondary supply route, a narrow gravel road winding through the lower pass. Vance's voice cut through the static of my earpiece once more, no longer calm, but filled with a cold, desperate malice. "She has extracted the server logs," he screamed to his remaining commanders over the open syndicate channel. "Target is moving west along the ridge. Eliminate her and destroy that drive." I reached the edge of the crest, ducking behind an outcrop of shale as mortar shells began to detonate along the slope behind me. Vance was throwing everything he had into erasing the evidence, willing to level the entire mountain to ensure those files never reached the regional inspector general. Down in the valley below, Lieutenant Hayes and his men had successfully crossed the river under the cover of the confusion I had created, reaching the eastern tree line where the incoming transport helicopter was already descending through the storm clouds. They were safe, but my own window of escape was rapidly closing. 4 mercenaries crested the ridge above me, locking their weapons onto my position from the high ground. I checked my sidearm magazine. I had 4 rounds remaining, no rifle ammunition, and an 80-foot drop to the swollen mountain river directly behind me. I pulled the hard drive containing Vance's complete paper trail from my vest, securing it into a waterproof, shock-resistant beacon pouch attached to my harness. I looked up at the advancing squad leader, who was raising his rifle with a triumphant, cruel sneer on his face, confident that he had me completely cornered. I did not give him the satisfaction of pulling the trigger. I stepped backward off the edge of the granite cliff, falling backward into the dark, roaring abyss of the ravine below, just as a wall of mortar fire detonated across the rocks where I had been standing. The icy water struck me like a physical blow, slamming the breath from my lungs and dragging me under the turbulent current. Rocks battered my shoulders and legs as the river tossed me down the canyon, but I fought my way to the surface, gasping for air and kicking toward the mud banks near the lower bend. When I dragged myself onto the gravel shore, bruised, bleeding, and shivering uncontrollably, the heavy thud of helicopter rotors echoed directly overhead. The extraction craft lowered its landing gear into the clearing 30 yards away, its searchlights cutting through the driving rain. Lieutenant Hayes jumped from the side door, his rifle raised, scanning the riverbank until his eyes landed on me. He ran forward, grabbing my arm to help pull me up from the mud, his face covered in grime and awe, as he recognized the lone shooter who had saved his entire team from annihilation. "We need to get you on this bird right now," Hayes yelled over the deafening roar of the engines, gesturing toward the open cabin where his wounded men were already being treated. I shook my head, standing firm on my own feet despite the sharp pain radiating from my fractured ribs. I reached into my harness, unclipped the waterproof beacon pouch containing the downloaded server logs, and pressed it directly into his blood-stained hands. "Not yet," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling of my cold lips as I looked him dead in the eye. "This drive contains the proof that Vance set up the ambush. Get this to the district prosecutor at the base and make sure he opens it in front of the military tribunal." Hayes stared at the drive in his hands, his expression hardening as the truth of what had happened on that mountain finally registered. "What are you going to do?" he asked, looking back toward the burning ridge. I looked up at the high road leading back toward the command compound, where the lights of Vance's private transport vehicle were already visible, speeding toward the highway to flee the area before the chopper landed. "I'm going to finish this," I said quietly, checking the action of my sidearm. "I'm going to make sure he stands trial." The night was deafeningly quiet inside the high-security hearing room of the Regional Military Tribunal, save for the rhythmic humming of the overhead fluorescent lights. Commander Marcus Vance sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, flanked by 3 military defense attorneys, his uniform spotless and his posture rigid with supreme confidence. He had spent the last 2 hours presenting his official operational report, explaining away the catastrophe in the valley as an unpredictable ambush by a superior mercenary force, while painting my disappearance as the rogue act of an unstable analyst who had abandoned her post under fire. The presiding judge, a decorated major general, adjusted his glasses and looked down at his notes. Is there any additional physical evidence to be presented before this tribunal considers the defense's motion to dismiss all charges regarding command negligence? The heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber swung open with a sharp, resonant thud. I walked down the central aisle, wearing my service dress uniform, my left arm held securely in a black sling. My posture was straight, my chin held high, and my stride measured. Behind me, Lieutenant Cole Hayes and Chief Petty Officer Ryan Miller entered the room, carrying a sealed metal case containing the verified digital drive. Vance turned his head, his face instantly draining of color as our eyes met across the room. His hands tightened into fists against the polished wood of the table, the arrogant smirk vanishing from his lips. I reached the podium, placed my right hand over the digital authentication scanner, and faced the tribunal panel. I present to the court the complete, unedited server logs extracted directly from Commander Vance's private terminal during the engagement at Grid Force 7, I said, my voice clear and unwavering, echoing off the high stone walls. These records include encrypted financial transfers from syndicate accounts, real-time tactical updates provided to enemy commanders, and explicit orders to collapse our position to ensure 0 survivors. Vance sprang from his seat, his chair sliding back violently against the floor. "This is a complete fabrication," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She is a disgraced officer facing desertion charges. That evidence is unverified and completely inadmissible." "Silence in the chamber," the Major General ordered, slamming his gavel onto the bench. A technical officer stepped forward, taking the drive from Hayes and connecting it directly to the courtroom's secure projection system. Within seconds, the large screens mounted along the walls flared to life, displaying time-stamped satellite feeds, encrypted audio files, and direct bank routing codes linking Vance to the Vulov Syndicate's leadership. The audio recording of Vance's own voice ordering Squad 3 to collapse the footbridge echoed through the quiet courtroom. Every officer sitting on the panel leaned forward, their expressions hardening into stone as the overwhelming weight of the evidence demolished every lie Vance had carefully constructed over the past 6 months. The defense attorneys slowly lowered their files, stepping away from Vance as they realized the absolute hopelessness of his position. The Major General removed his glasses, looking at Vance with a cold, disgusted stare that declared the verdict long before the formal judgment was read. "Commander Marcus Vance," the general said softly, his voice heavy with contempt. "You are relieved of your command effective immediately, and you will be remanded into military custody pending formal court-martial proceedings for high treason and conspiracy to murder under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. MP, secure the prisoner." 2 armed military policemen stepped forward, pinning Vance's arms behind his back and snapping cold iron handcuffs around his wrists. As they dragged him past my podium toward the side exit, Vance leaned in, his teeth gritted, his eyes burning with intense hatred. "You destroyed everything," he hissed under his breath. "You destroyed my career, my life, my family name." I looked him straight in the eyes, without a single trace of anger, fear, or desire for revenge. "You destroyed yourself the moment you treated the lives of your soldiers as disposable assets," I replied calmly, stepping back to allow the guards to take him away. 3 weeks later, the morning sun broke over the mountain ridge, washing the ancient pine trees in warm, golden light. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of fresh earth and morning dew, completely free of the suffocating stench of cordite and burning metal that had haunted my dreams for weeks. I stood on the rocky ledge overlooking the valley where Team Alpha had been cornered. My body was still healing, the sharp pain in my ribs reduced to a dull, manageable ache, but the suffocating weight that had rested on my chest since the ambush was entirely gone. A soft footstep sounded behind me on the gravel. Lieutenant Hayes walked up to the edge of the cliff, holding 2 stainless steel travel mugs. He handed one to me, looking out over the vast, peaceful canopy below. "Vance's tribunal concluded this morning," Hayes said quietly, taking a sip of his coffee. "Life sentence at Leavenworth. No parole. The entire network he built has been completely dismantled from top to bottom." I nodded slowly, taking in the serene beauty of the forest stretching out to the horizon. Justice had been served, not through violent retaliation or dark hatred, but through truth, cold logic, and unwavering discipline. "The brass offered you a full reinstatement," Hayes continued, turning his head to look at me with profound respect, "and a promotion to Chief Intelligence Director for the entire task force. You earned it, Chloe." I looked down at the coffee in my hands, then back toward the open sky above the mountains. I had spent years hiding in the shadows, fighting against a corrupt system from the inside, proving my worth on grounds defined by men who never truly saw me as an equal. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I handed the mug back to him with a calm, genuine smile. "Tell the brass I appreciate the offer, Cole," I said, my voice rich with internal peace and absolute certainty. "But my time in the shadows is over." I turned and began my walk down the mountain path, stepping into the bright, clear light of a brand new day, entirely free, entirely whole, and finally, at peace with myself.